Germany did not lose the war at Stalingrad, and it did not lose because of the Russian winter. Just 5 weeks after invading the Soviet Union, while German tanks were still advancing and victory seemed certain, the Army's Chief of Staff was already writing in his diary that he was on the brink of despair, which meant the largest invasion in history was failing before the famous battles had even begun. The problem was not strategy or willpower, but math. The army that conquered France in 6 weeks could not supply itself in Russia because trucks broke down faster than they could be repaired, horses died faster than they could be replaced, and railways could not be converted fast enough to keep up with the advance. These problems did not come from bad luck or harsh weather, but were built into the campaign from the start, and no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome them. Yet, the Eastern Front was only part of the story. While German armies struggled in Russia, other battles were shaping the war in ways that rarely appear in popular histories, including convoy battles in the Atlantic that determined whether Britain would survive, a siege in Libya that proved Germany could be stopped, and a 5-week campaign against Vichy French forces in Syria that protected the oil supplies fueling the entire Allied war effort. These overlooked engagements, combined with the structural weaknesses that crippled Germany from the beginning, explain why Hitler lost the war more completely than the famous stories of Stalingrad and winter ever could. Section 1. The Atlantic Lifeline. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single engagement, but a 6-year campaign stretching from the war's first day to its last. Without victory in these waters, everything else the Allies accomplished would have been impossible. The 2 million American soldiers who eventually landed in France arrived on ships that crossed the Atlantic, while the tanks, aircraft, and ammunition they used traveled the same dangerous routes. At the same time, supplies that kept the Soviet Union fighting through the Lend-Lease program moved through Atlantic convoy routes, including over 400,000 trucks that gave the Soviet Army the mobility it needed to launch deep operations against German forces. If Germany had won the Atlantic battle, there would have been no D-Day, no American buildup in Britain, and no equipment reaching Russia through northern ports. In his book, The Battle of the Atlantic, Jonathan Dimbleby documented the campaign that made all subsequent Allied operations possible. German U-boats hunted in groups called wolf packs, spreading across the convoy routes and waiting for targets. When one submarine spotted a convoy, it would shadow the merchant ships while radioing their position to other U-boats in the area. At night, the submarines would surface and attack together, firing torpedoes into the massive ships before diving to escape the escorts. A single Wolfpack attack could sink dozens of vessels over the course of a night, sending thousands of tons of supplies to the bottom of the ocean along with the men who crewed them. The numbers tell the story of how costly this battle was. U-boat crews experienced a 75% death rate, which was the highest of any military branch in any nation during the entire conflict. Over 30,000 Allied merchant seamen lost their lives, and more than 3,000 ships sank beneath the waves. Convoys sometimes lost a quarter of their ships in a single crossing. Survivors who made it through one voyage had to turn around and cross again, knowing the odds grew worse with each trip. The Royal Navy struggled to counter the U-boat threat in the early years because, as Dimbleby noted, the service had developed a romance with battleships and viewed convoy escort duty as defensive and unglamorous. The Navy possessed data from 1917 proving that convoys defeated the U-boat threat in the previous war, yet admirals preferred hunting submarines aggressively rather than guarding merchant ships. This attitude delayed the effective implementation of convoys, and thousands of sailors died while the Navy slowly developed the escorts, aircraft, and coordination needed to make the system work. Even after commanders accepted that convoys worked, putting them into practice was not simple because the system required escorts, aircraft, and coordination that took time to build. Destroyers and corvettes had to be constructed in large numbers. Crews had to be trained to operate them, and patrol aircraft had to be modified for long flights over open ocean while radar sets were installed and operators learned to use them. All of this took years, and during those years, the U-boats continued sinking ship after ship. The turning point came in May 1943, a month so devastating for Germany that historians call it Black May. In that single month alone, 43 U-boats were destroyed, and Admiral Dönitz withdrew his remaining boats from the North Atlantic entirely because the losses were simply too heavy to continue. Several factors combined to produce this sudden reversal. Radar now enabled detection of surfaced U-boats at night and in fog. Long-range patrol aircraft finally closed the mid-Atlantic gap where submarines had operated beyond air coverage. Small escort carriers sailed with convoys and provided air protection throughout the crossing. Improved depth charges increased the rate at which submarines were destroyed, and code-breaking through ultra-intelligence allowed convoys to be routed away from known U-boat positions. With the submarine threat broken, the supply route to Britain was secured, and ships that had been sunk faster than they could be replaced were now crossing safely in large numbers. The buildup for the invasion of France could proceed without the threat of supply problems that had haunted Allied planners for years. Germany's defeat in the Atlantic directly contributed to Hitler's defeat in the war as a whole. Britain remained supplied and undefeated, which allowed it to serve as the base from which the invasion of France was launched in June 1944. After May 1943, convoys crossed safely in large numbers, bringing over 2 million American soldiers to Europe, along with the equipment they needed to fight. Lend-Lease supplies continued flowing to the Soviet Union, giving the Red Army the trucks, fuel, and food it needed to push German forces back across Eastern Europe. Every Allied victory from D-Day onward depended on the Atlantic sea lanes remaining open. Historian Gerhard Weinberg, in A World at Arms, pointed to another consequence of the submarine campaign that is often overlooked. Resources devoted to U-boat construction meant thousands of tanks were never built, because the steel that could have made armor went into submarine hulls instead. The skilled workers who could have assembled tanks worked in submarine yards, and the technical expertise that could have improved German ground forces was directed toward underwater warfare. Germany faced impossible choices about how to use its limited resources, and every choice meant giving up something else. This reflected a deeper problem that would define the entire war. Germany simply did not have enough resources to fight effectively on multiple fronts at once. The Atlantic battle also revealed a pattern that would repeat across every front. Allied forces learned from their mistakes, while German forces did not. Early in the campaign, convoys sailed with inadequate protection and losses mounted until Britain's situation grew serious. However, the Allies adapted by developing new technologies like improved radar and more effective depth charges, changing tactics based on hard experience, and building purpose-designed escort carriers that could sail with convoys and provide continuous air cover. Each month brought improvements as lessons from failed convoys were studied and applied. Historian Richard Overy, in Why the Allies Won, observed that Allied combat effectiveness rose continuously, while Axis effectiveness first leveled off and then declined. He attributed this difference to the systematic way Allied forces incorporated lessons from defeats. When something failed, the Allies analyzed why, made changes, and tried again, and this process of continuous improvement gave them an advantage that grew larger as the war continued. Germany, by contrast, continued building U-boats even after the battle was clearly lost, with the submarine force receiving new boats throughout 1944 and into 1945. Long after the Atlantic battle had been decided. This rigidity would prove fatal across every front where German forces fought. The war rewarded adaptation, and Germany's command structure had become incapable of it. While the U-boat campaign consumed German resources in a losing effort, an even larger disaster was unfolding on the Eastern Front, where the same problems of logistics and overreach would produce far greater damage. Section 2. The Eastern Front. On June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German troops crossed into the Soviet Union in the largest military invasion ever recorded. The front stretched over 1,000 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, with 3 army groups advancing at the same time toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. Hitler's goal was straightforward: destroy the Soviet state in a single campaign before winter arrived. The surprise was complete, and Soviet forces were caught unprepared. In the first hours, German units advanced with little opposition, capturing thousands of prisoners and destroying aircraft still sitting on their runways. The stunning victories of 1939 and 1940 seemed to prove this approach could succeed, as Poland had fallen in just 4 weeks, Denmark and Norway followed shortly after, and France collapsed in only 6 weeks despite having resisted Germany for 4 years in the previous war. German commanders had reason to believe they could defeat any enemy through rapid, concentrated attacks because the pattern had worked every time they tried it. Yet, the army that crossed into Russia carried weaknesses that would undermine the entire campaign. According to historian David Stahl's research on Operation Barbarossa and Germany's defeat in the East, the German army was actually less motorized in 1941 than it had been in 1940, which resulted from a process of removing vehicles from units to save fuel and spare parts for a campaign expected to end quickly. Only 16 divisions were fully motorized, while the remaining 134 divisions relied on 750,000 horses for transportation. These horses required enormous quantities of fodder and water every day, moved far slower than motor vehicles, and could not be quickly replaced when they died from exhaustion, disease, or enemy action. The motorized units that did exist faced problems of their own because the Army operated over 2,000 different vehicle types, and Army Group Center alone stocked more than 1 million different spare part types in its supply depots. A single panzer division contained 96 different types of personnel carriers, 111 different types of trucks, and 37 different types of motorcycles. When a vehicle broke down, finding the correct replacement part meant searching through this enormous variety, and a truck might sit useless for weeks while mechanics tried to locate the one component it needed. Military historian Martin van Creveld, in Supplying War, argued that the campaign was impossible from its very beginning. Only one railway line served each German army group, when military doctrine required one line per army, which meant the supply system operated at a fraction of the capacity it needed. Russian railways used a wider gauge than European railways, so every section of track required conversion before German trains could use it. This process took weeks per section, and partisan attacks frequently destroyed completed work behind the advancing armies, forcing engineers to repair the same stretches of track over and over again. Van Creveld calculated that beyond 500 kilometers from a functioning railhead, motor transport simply could not keep the army supplied because trucks consumed nearly as much fuel delivering supplies as the supplies they carried. To reach Moscow by motor transport alone would have required roughly 10 times the number of vehicles actually available. Not all historians accept that defeat was inevitable from the start. The conventional view holds that Germany could have won with different decisions at key moments. If Hitler had not diverted forces south to Kiev in August 1941, Moscow might have fallen before winter. If resources had been concentrated rather than spread across multiple objectives, the decisive blow might have landed. In this interpretation, the invasion failed because of poor choices, not because it was impossible. Economist Adam Tooze, in The Wages of Destruction, challenged this view entirely. He argued that Germany's resource base made defeat inevitable regardless of what decisions were made. Germany was simply too small and lacked too many critical materials to defeat the coalition forming against it. The combined industrial capacity of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire so vastly exceeded Germany's capacity that no sequence of battlefield victories could have closed the gap. In Tooze's interpretation, the war was lost before it began. General Thomas, head of the War Economy and Armaments Office, warned about critical fuel shortages 9 days before the invasion began, but the warning went unheeded. The campaign launched despite known constraints on fuel supply. Thomas had calculated that Germany did not have enough fuel reserves to sustain a long campaign, but his concerns were dismissed because the plan assumed a quick victory that would capture Soviet oil fields before German reserves ran out. When the quick victory failed to happen, the fuel shortage became a constant problem that limited what German forces could do. The supply crisis became evident far earlier than most popular accounts acknowledge. Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, wrote in his diary during July 1941 that he was on the brink of despair, while Hitler himself confided privately that he was not sleeping at night because the situation remained unclear. These admissions came just 5 weeks into the invasion, 3 full months before the winter cold that supposedly stopped the German advance. The popular story of General Winter defeating Germany has shaped how millions understand the war, but the evidence points in a different direction. Stahl showed that German commanders were expressing despair in July, 3 months before winter arrived. The logistics crisis was already crippling operations while the weather remained warm. Tank commander Otto Carius recorded in his memoir that Russian summer dust proved as damaging to equipment as winter cold ever would be, penetrating engines and clogging weapons while air filters failed to keep up. These problems occurred in July, not January. Winter made an already failing campaign worse, but it did not cause the failure. German soldiers also discovered that Soviet equipment was often as good as or better than their own. General von Kleist admitted after the war that Russian tanks, rifles, and anti-tank guns were frequently superior to German equipment. The Soviet T-34 tank came as a complete shock to German forces, with strong armor, an effective shape that deflected shells, and a powerful cannon. German tank guns could barely damage it, and the 88mm anti-aircraft gun was the only German weapon that could reliably destroy the T-34. But there were not enough of these guns to go around. The Battle of Moscow in late 1941 became the first major test of whether Germany could achieve the quick victory its strategy required. By October, German forces had advanced to within sight of the Soviet capital, close enough that soldiers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Victory seemed close, and German commanders believed one final push would end the campaign. However, the army that reached Moscow's outskirts was exhausted, short of supplies, and weakened by months of continuous fighting. Inside Moscow, historian Roderick Braithwaite documented in Moscow 1941 a breakdown that brought the Soviet capital to the edge of collapse. On October 16th, disorder spread through the city on a scale unprecedented in Soviet history. Factories suddenly closed, and workers were dismissed with whatever cash was available. Looting broke out as people raided abandoned shops and apartments, and anti-government statements were made openly in public spaces where such words normally meant arrest. For several days, it appeared Moscow might fall not to German assault, but to domestic breakdown. However, Stalin made a decision that shaped how the battle unfolded. He stayed in Moscow. On November 6, 1941, he delivered the annual anniversary speech in the Mayakovsky metro station, the deepest station in Moscow, where participants would be protected from German bombing. The next day, he ordered the traditional military parade to proceed, despite German forces being positioned within striking distance. General Artemiev assembled 28,000 troops for the event, including cadets, infantry, veterans, cavalry, and roughly 200 tanks. The parade began at 8 a.m. rather than the traditional 10 a.m. to reduce the risk of German air attack, and those who participated remembered the experience throughout their lives as proof that the Soviet state would not give up. At the same time, the Soviets accomplished something that historian Richard Overy called one of the most remarkable industrial feats of the war. Over 1,500 factories were evacuated eastward beyond the Ural Mountains during autumn 1941, with entire industries taken apart piece by piece and loaded onto trains, along with workers and their families. Within months of arriving at new locations, these factories resumed production, which meant Soviet industrial capacity was actually expanding while German forces advanced. The December counteroffensive changed the strategic situation entirely. Fresh Soviet troops from Siberia, held in reserve until intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack from the east, struck exhausted German positions along the entire front. These forces were properly equipped for winter with appropriate clothing, white camouflage, and skis for movement, while German troops remained in summer uniforms because winter equipment could not be transported forward due to railway congestion. The fighting was brutal. German soldiers who had advanced hundreds of miles now found themselves pushed back, their units shattered by attacks from troops who seemed immune to the cold. Frostbite claimed thousands of casualties as men without proper clothing tried to hold positions in temperatures that dropped far below freezing. Equipment froze and refused to function, tanks would not start, weapons jammed, and vehicles sat immobile because their fuel had turned to gel. Hitler responded with his stand-fast order, prohibiting any retreat. Historians Ronald Smelser and Edward Davies, in The Myth of the Eastern Front, showed that the blame Hitler narrative that emerged after the war served post-war interests, as both Germans and Americans wanted to present the German military as professional soldiers led astray by a madman. This made it easier to rebuild West Germany as a Cold War ally, but it obscured the reality that both Hitler and his generals made serious errors throughout the campaign. Historians disagree about whether Moscow or Stalingrad was the true turning point of the war. Stahel argued that Moscow in December 1941 was the most consequential moment because it eliminated any possibility of the rapid victory that Germany's strategy required. Once the Soviet Union survived the initial blow, it could mobilize its vast resources for a long war that Germany could not win. In this view, everything after Moscow was simply the working out of a defeat that had already occurred. Others point to Stalingrad as the decisive moment, arguing that Germany still had chances to win even after Moscow. The 1942 summer offensive came close to capturing the oil fields that would have sustained German operations, and a different outcome at Stalingrad might have changed the war's trajectory. The debate continues because both interpretations rest on solid evidence. The following year, Stalingrad became the battle that shattered the myth of German invincibility. The city was not even the original objective of Germany's 1942 summer campaign. The primary goal had been securing oil fields in the Caucasus, which Germany desperately needed to continue operations. However, Hitler became increasingly focused on capturing the city bearing Stalin's name, and what began as a position to protect the flank of the main advance became an objective that consumed an entire army. The fighting inside Stalingrad was unlike anything seen before in the war. The city stretched for miles along the Volga River, and German forces had to clear it building by building, room by room. Soviet defenders turned every factory, every apartment block, and every pile of rubble into a strongpoint, while snipers waited in the ruins and small groups of fighters held positions for days against repeated attacks. The German advance slowed to a crawl measured in meters rather than kilometers, and divisions that had swept across hundreds of miles in the summer found themselves fighting for weeks to capture a single building. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that encircled the entire German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. Over 250,000 German and Axis soldiers found themselves trapped, surrounded by Soviet forces that cut off all ground routes for supply or escape. Hitler ordered the army to hold its position and refused permission to attempt a breakout while escape was still possible. Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring promised delivery of 500 tons of supplies daily by air, but the actual average achieved was only 90 tons, while the army required at least 300 tons merely to survive. In Stopped at Stalingrad, Joel Hayward documented how transport aircraft attempting to reach the pocket were shot down in large numbers, and experienced crews who had trained for years were killed in weeks. Men inside the pocket starved and froze in their positions while waiting for supplies that never arrived in sufficient quantities. The human toll was staggering. Approximately 800,000 Axis soldiers, including Germans, Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians, were killed, wounded, or captured during the Stalingrad campaign. Germany lost the entire Sixth Army, which had been considered one of the finest formations in the German military, and the Luftwaffe never recovered from losses sustained during the failed airlift. Analysis in John Lawrence's book War by Numbers showed that German tactical superiority remained significant even as the strategic situation worsened. However, tactical skill could not overcome strategic reality because winning every battle does not produce victory if casualties and equipment losses exceed replacement capacity. Stalingrad's contribution to Hitler's defeat extended beyond the immediate military losses. The destruction of an entire German army proved that Germany could be beaten, which encouraged resistance movements across occupied Europe and strengthened the resolve of Allied nations to continue fighting. The losses in men and equipment could not be replaced, weakening German forces across all fronts, and the Luftwaffe's losses during the airlift meant that Germany had fewer aircraft available to defend against Allied bombing raids that would devastate German industry in the years that followed. By 1944, the production gap between the two sides had grown enormously. American factories alone produced over 100,000 aircraft per year, while Germany and Japan combined produced only 68,000, and Soviet tank production reached 29,000 in 1944 compared to Germany's 18,000. Overy showed in Russia's war that the common view of Soviet tactics as human wave attacks obscures the industrial reality behind Soviet victory, because the Soviets won through superior production combined with steadily improving methods, not simply through numbers of soldiers. The Eastern Front consumed roughly 80% of German military strength throughout the war, grinding down divisions that could not be rebuilt and destroying equipment that could not be replaced. Yet, even as this massive struggle continued, other battles far from Russia were shaping the war's outcome in ways that would determine whether the Allies could turn Germany's problems into total defeat. Section 3. The Forgotten Campaigns. While the world's attention focused on the Eastern Front, battles in the Middle East, North Africa, and East Africa were shaping the war against Hitler in ways that rarely appear in popular histories. These overlooked campaigns protected Allied oil supplies, held positions that blocked German expansion, and provided soldiers who would fight German forces across multiple continents. In Syria and Lebanon during June 1941, while Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Allied forces fought a campaign that directly prevented German expansion into the Middle East. The stakes were enormous. In May 1941, more than 100 German aircraft had been using Vichy French airfields in Syria to support a pro-German government that had briefly seized power in Iraq. If Germany had established a permanent presence in Syria, the Suez Canal would have been threatened from the north, and Middle East oil supplies could have been cut off entirely. Britain and its allies depended on this oil to fuel their war effort, and losing access to it would have crippled military operations against Germany across every front. Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle expected that Vichy troops would not seriously resist. De Gaulle believed the campaign could be won through propaganda and persuasion, assuming French soldiers would not fire on other Frenchmen fighting under the banner of Free France. In Syria and Lebanon, 1941, David Sutton documented a campaign far more difficult than planners anticipated. Allied units were ordered to advance with white flags and French-speaking officers calling through megaphones, urging Vichy soldiers to join the Free French cause. Some Australian units marched toward enemy positions wearing their distinctive slouch hats, hoping that Vichy troops would remember Australian sacrifices in the previous war and decline to fire. Within hours, as artillery shells and machine gun bullets arrived instead of surrender, the Australians replaced their slouch hats with steel helmets and prepared for serious fighting. The combat that followed surprised everyone with its intensity. Veterans of the First World War who participated in the campaign compared fighting at the Litani River to Western Front battles, saying the artillery barrages were as heavy as anything they had experienced in France or Belgium 25 years earlier. Individual soldiers performed acts of extraordinary courage during the campaign. Private Clarence Atkinson, a 26-year-old from New South Wales, charged a Vichy machine gun post that had pinned down his entire platoon. Armed with a bag full of grenades, he darted from rock to rock, threw his grenades, and captured the gun single-handed. He became the first known Aboriginal Australian to receive the Distinguished Conduct Medal in the Second World War. The ceasefire came at 1 minute past midnight on July 12, 1941, after 5 weeks of fighting and higher casualties than expected. Securing Syria eliminated the threat of German air power in the Middle East and protected the oil supplies that would fuel Allied operations for the rest of the war. Without this oil, the tanks that fought Rommel in North Africa, the ships that crossed the Atlantic, and the aircraft that bombed Germany could not have operated. Earlier that same year, Australian forces at Tobruk in Libya inflicted the first significant defeat on German forces during the entire war. This mattered enormously at a time when German victories seemed unstoppable. France had fallen, the Balkans had been conquered, and German forces appeared invincible. Then, Australian troops held the Libyan port for months against repeated German and Italian attacks, showing that determined defenders could stop the Wehrmacht. The siege of Tobruk lasted 241 days, from April to December 1941. German and Italian forces surrounded the port and attempted to break through the defensive perimeter multiple times, but the Australian garrison held firm. Rommel, who had swept across North Africa with apparent ease, found himself unable to capture a single port defended by troops who refused to retreat. The defense of Tobruk tied down Axis forces that could have been used elsewhere and proved that German armies were not unbeatable. News of the defense spread across the Allied world, providing a morale boost when such news was desperately needed. If Australians could have held Tobruk, perhaps the war would not have been lost. The psychological impact of this first defeat mattered almost as much as the military impact because it showed that resistance was not futile. In East Africa, British and Commonwealth forces destroyed an entire Italian army in a campaign that secured the southern approaches to the Suez Canal. Italian forces in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia numbered over 250,000 troops, and their presence threatened British supply lines through the Red Sea. By November 1941, Italian resistance in East Africa had ended, freeing British forces for other operations and eliminating another threat to the vital oil routes. These campaigns revealed something that popular histories often overlook. The war against Hitler was fought not just in Europe, but across the globe. Historian Christopher Bailey and Tim Harper, in Forgotten Armies, documented how colonial forces from India, Australia, Africa, and elsewhere filled critical positions throughout the war. The Indian Army numbered over 2.5 million volunteers by war's end, which made it the largest volunteer army in human history. These soldiers fought against German and Italian forces in North Africa, at Monte Cassino in Italy, and in dozens of other locations where their contributions have been largely forgotten. At the same time, Germany's Axis partner Japan was discovering the same harsh truth about logistics that was destroying German armies in Russia. In New Guinea, Japanese forces attempting to capture Port Moresby found their supply lines collapsing in jungle terrain, with soldiers starving while still advancing. In Burma, Japan's greatest land offensive of the war ended in disaster when supply problems caused more casualties than combat. The pattern was identical across both theaters. Armies that advanced beyond their supply capacity were destroyed, regardless of how well their soldiers fought. The forgotten campaigns against Germany directly contributed to Hitler's defeat in multiple ways. Syria protected the oil that fueled Allied operations. Tobruk proved German forces could be stopped and tied down Axis troops for months. East Africa secured supply routes through the Red Sea, and colonial forces from across the British Empire provided millions of soldiers who fought German and Italian forces while American industrial power was still being mobilized. Without these contributions, the Allied war effort would have collapsed long before D-Day became possible, proving that the forgotten campaigns and forgotten soldiers were just as essential to Hitler's defeat as the famous battles that dominate popular memory. Section 4. The Mediterranean Struggle. The Mediterranean theater showed how battles in seemingly secondary locations could shape the entire war's outcome by consuming Axis resources, protecting Allied supply lines, and providing the combat experience that would prove essential when the decisive campaigns finally came. Historian Gerhard Weinberg, in A World at Arms, characterized the tiny island of Malta as the fulcrum of the Mediterranean War. Malta occupied a position astride supply routes from Italy to North Africa, sitting directly in the path that Axis ships had to take to deliver supplies to Rommel's forces in Libya. British aircraft and submarines operating from Malta intercepted these supply ships, sinking tankers full of fuel and freighters loaded with tanks, ammunition, and food. Every ton of supplies that failed to reach North Africa weakened Rommel's ability to advance toward the Suez Canal, and if Rommel had captured the canal, Britain would have lost its shortest route to Middle East oil and to India. At the peak of Axis attacks, Malta sustained heavier bombing per square mile than any other location during the entire war. German and Italian aircraft pounded the island day after day, trying to neutralize the threat it posed to their supply lines, while the population approached starvation as supply convoys attempting to reach the island were destroyed one after another. Merchant ships carrying food and fuel were sunk within sight of the island's harbors, yet the garrison continued to fight. As long as Malta held, Rommel could not receive adequate supplies for the decisive operations he planned. The North Africa campaigns drained Axis resources that were desperately needed on the Eastern Front. Germany sent troops, aircraft, and tanks to support Italian forces in Libya, committing strength that could have made a difference in Russia. Fuel that could have gone to panzer divisions fighting toward Moscow went instead to Rommel's forces in the desert, and aircraft that could have supported the Eastern Front flew over the Mediterranean instead. Every commitment to North Africa meant less strength available for the war against the Soviet Union, stretching German resources thinner across multiple fronts that Germany could not adequately supply. The Tunisia campaign that followed the Allied landings in November 1942 produced consequences extending well beyond the desert. When Axis resistance prolonged fighting by 4 months beyond Allied projections, any possibility of invading France in 1943 vanished entirely. There was simply not enough time to redeploy forces from North Africa, reorganize them in Britain, and prepare for a cross-channel assault against fortified German positions. Approximately 250,000 Axis troops were captured when Tunisia finally fell in May 1943, which represented losses comparable to the forces destroyed at Stalingrad. These were experienced soldiers and irreplaceable equipment that Germany could not afford to lose. The delay had major consequences for relations among the Allies. Soviet forces fought essentially alone against the bulk of the German army for an additional year, and Stalin demanded throughout 1942 and 1943 that the Western Allies open a second front in France to relieve pressure on his armies. When the 1943 Second Front turned out to be Italy rather than France, Soviet suspicions about Western commitment deepened, and these wartime disagreements contributed to the tensions that would define international politics for decades after the war ended. The Italian campaign that followed the July 1943 invasion of Sicily developed into grinding warfare that more closely resembled the First World War than the mobile operations that had characterized earlier fighting. The Battle of Monte Cassino became what historian Matthew Parker termed the hardest-fought battle of World War II. The ancient monastery, established in the 6th century, occupied a mountain position that dominated the only practical route to Rome through the Liri Valley, and German defenders converted the position into a fortified strongpoint that resisted every Allied attack for months. The Allies launched 4 separate offensives against Monte Cassino between January and May 1944, and each assault failed with heavy casualties as infantry struggled uphill against prepared defenses that nullified Allied advantages in tanks and artillery. The terrain favored defenders so heavily that Allied numerical superiority meant little, and soldiers who survived the fighting described conditions as horrific as anything from the previous war. All nationalities under Allied command suffered heavy losses on the Italian mountainsides. American, British, Indian, Polish, New Zealand, French, and colonial forces from across the French Empire all bled in the fighting around Monte Cassino. Indian forces sustained more casualties at Monte Cassino than any other nationality, a fact often overlooked in accounts that focus primarily on American and British contributions. Polish forces finally captured the monastery in May 1944, finding it reduced to rubble by months of bombardment, but the cost had been enormous. Scholarly debate continues over whether the Mediterranean strategy ultimately helped or hindered the Allied war effort. Churchill argued passionately that the region represented the soft underbelly of Europe. Attacking through the Mediterranean would weaken Germany by forcing it to defend another front, removing Italy from the war, eliminating one of Germany's allies, and eventually opening a southern approach to Germany itself. American commanders, led by General Marshall, argued with equal conviction that a direct assault on France would be more decisive. Every soldier fighting in Italy was a soldier who could not participate in the cross-channel attack, and every ship supporting Mediterranean operations was a ship unavailable for the invasion of France. The Italian terrain so strongly favored defenders that advances came slowly and at tremendous cost. The evidence supports elements of both interpretations. Mediterranean operations did draw German forces away from the Eastern Front at important moments, with over 20 German divisions tied down in Italy by 1944. They secured vital oil supplies in the Middle East and provided essential experience in landing troops from ships onto hostile beaches. Allied forces learned hard lessons from the invasions of Sicily and Salerno that they applied when planning the far larger landing at Normandy. However, Mediterranean campaigns consumed enormous resources and delayed the cross-channel attack by at least 1 full year. Whether this delay ultimately helped or hurt the Allied cause remains debated because the same evidence can be read to support either conclusion. The Mediterranean campaigns contributed to Hitler's defeat in ways that extended beyond the immediate battles. The 250,000 troops lost in Tunisia could not defend the beaches of France. The divisions tied down in Italy could not reinforce the Eastern Front. The aircraft lost over Malta and North Africa could not protect German cities from Allied bombing. And the experience Allied forces gained in amphibious operations made the Normandy landings possible. Each Mediterranean battle weakened Germany's ability to fight elsewhere, and by 1944, the cumulative effect of these losses had stretched German forces beyond their capacity to defend every threatened front. The same pattern of logistical overreach that had crippled German armies in Russia appeared in the Mediterranean as well. Rommel's forces in North Africa suffered from supply shortages throughout the campaign, never receiving enough fuel, ammunition, or replacements to achieve a decisive victory. Germany was fighting too many battles in too many places with too few resources, and the Mediterranean theater absorbed strength that might have changed outcomes elsewhere. Section 5. The Learning Curve. The pattern of institutional adaptation that emerged during the Atlantic Campaign repeated across every front, and this difference between Allied and Axis approaches to learning from failure ultimately proved more important than any single battle. In February 1943, the same month the Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad, American forces suffered a humiliating defeat in North Africa that would reveal how the two sides responded differently to setbacks. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, green American soldiers who had never experienced combat faced German veterans who had been fighting and winning for years. Command coordination failed completely as different American units operated without supporting each other. Communications broke down at critical moments, and equipment was abandoned during panicked retreats as soldiers fled from advancing German tanks. The defeat was comprehensive and embarrassing, raising questions about whether American forces could ever compete with their German counterparts on the battlefield. However, what happened in the following months showed why the Allies would ultimately win the war. Within weeks of the disaster, the entire American military system began responding to what had gone wrong at Kasserine. Officers analyzed the battle in detail, identifying specific failures and their causes, and the doctrine was revised based on what they learned. Commanders who had failed were replaced with others who showed more promise, with General Fredendall removed from command and the aggressive General Patton taking over to impose new methods and stricter discipline. Troops were retrained using updated tactics that addressed the specific weaknesses the battle had exposed. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was practiced repeatedly, and communication procedures were improved throughout the chain of command. By the end of the Tunisia campaign, just a few months later, the same American forces were defeating the same German units they had fled from at Kasserine. Historian Richard Overy identified this pattern of institutional learning as one of the decisive factors in Allied victory. In Why the Allies Won, Overy argued that this ability to learn mattered more than any individual engagement. Allied combat effectiveness rose continuously throughout the war, while Axis effectiveness first leveled off and then declined, and Overy attributed this difference to the systematic way Allied forces incorporated lessons from defeats. When something failed, the Allies analyzed why it had failed, made changes based on their analysis, and tried again with improved methods. This process operated at every level, from individual units to entire armies. Tactics that proved ineffective were abandoned, weapons that performed poorly were replaced or improved, and officers who could not adapt were moved aside. The result was military forces that grew more capable with each passing month, even as they suffered losses along the way. Germany moved in precisely the opposite direction as the war continued. From 1941 onward, Hitler increasingly controlled operational details that should have been left to field commanders who understood local conditions. Generals who withdrew without Hitler's explicit permission faced removal, disgrace, or worse, and independent judgment, which had been a German military strength, became dangerous. Officers learned that the safest course was to follow orders exactly, even when those orders made no sense given the situation on the ground. More than 15,000 German soldiers were executed for disciplinary offenses during the war, which was equivalent to an entire division killed by their own side. The message was clear: obey orders or face death. The initiative and flexibility that had produced Germany's early victories gradually disappeared under this pressure, and officers who might have adapted to changing circumstances instead followed rigid procedures even when those procedures led to failure. German industrial minister Albert Speer, observing the problem from inside the system, noted that Germany suffered from an arthritic organizational system, while the Allies excelled at the art of improvisation. The German system had become rigid and slow to change, with procedures that had worked in 1940 still being followed in 1944, even though the situation had changed completely. The Allies, by contrast, constantly adjusted their methods based on experience, creating a growing gap between the two sides that widened with each passing year. Analysis in John Lawrence's book, War by Numbers, showed that German tactical skill remained significant even as the strategic situation worsened. At Kursk in 1943, German attacks succeeded at force ratios where Soviet attacks at the same odds typically failed, and even late in the war, German units often inflicted heavier casualties than they suffered in individual engagements. German training and small unit tactics remained effective throughout the conflict. However, tactical skill could not overcome strategic reality, because winning every battle does not produce victory if casualties and equipment losses exceed replacement capacity. By 1944, German forces were fighting with the same methods they had used in 1941, but with continuously shrinking resources, which meant they could win individual engagements while still losing the war. The question of who deserves blame for Germany's defeat has been shaped by post-war interests as much as by historical evidence. For decades after 1945, the popular view held that Hitler's interference with his generals caused the defeat. German commanders who survived the war wrote memoirs arguing they would have won if Hitler had listened to their professional advice, and this explanation proved attractive in post-war West Germany because it allowed people to blame the regime while praising the military. Weinberg noted that these generals blamed Hitler for every battle they lost while claiming credit for every victory, meaning their memoirs were self-serving narratives rather than objective historical accounts. Smelser and Davies in The Myth of the Eastern Front showed that this narrative also served American interests during the Cold War, as both Germans and Americans wanted to present the German military as professional soldiers led astray by a madman. This made it easier to rebuild West Germany as a military ally against the Soviet Union, and former German officers became consultants and advisors whose version of events became the accepted story. The reality is that both Hitler and his generals made serious errors throughout the war. They disagreed constantly about strategy, but neither side had a plan that could actually succeed given Germany's resources. Van Creveld argued that debates about whether to focus on Moscow or Kiev in 1941 missed the real problem entirely because the logistics could not support either option adequately. Germany was attempting something impossible with the resources it had available. The learning curve directly contributed to Hitler's defeat because it meant the gap between Allied and German capabilities grew wider every year. In 1941, German forces had advantages in training, experience, and tactical coordination that allowed them to defeat larger enemy forces. By 1944, Allied forces had closed this gap through systematic improvement, while German forces had stagnated under rigid command structures. Allied armies that had been routed in 1940 and 1941 became the forces that liberated Western Europe and drove into Germany itself. The Germans, who had seemed invincible in the war's early years, found themselves facing opponents who had learned from every defeat and improved after every setback. By 1944, Allied forces had developed effective methods, overwhelming material superiority, and command structures designed to learn and improve. German forces still used the same approaches from 1941, but with continuously shrinking resources and increasing rigidity. The contrast between the two sides had become too great to overcome, and this difference in institutional learning proved as important to Hitler's defeat as any battle. Yet, institutional learning alone did not decide the war. It combined with logistics failures that crippled German operations from the summer of 1941, peripheral campaigns that protected Allied oil and proved Germany could be stopped, and industrial capacity that the Axis powers could never match. Each factor reinforced the others, creating a situation that grew worse for Germany with every passing month. The war ended not because of a single turning point, but because these factors operated together across every front. Logistics, adaptation, coalition strength, and industrial capacity combined to produce an outcome that no single battle or decision could have changed. Germany's defeat resulted from structural problems that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. But while the war ended in total collapse, the plans Hitler had for victory reveal an even darker vision of what he intended to build on the ashes of his enemies. To see what the world would have looked like if Germany had won, watch this video next.